Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, students, friends. I want to welcome you all here at the Graduate Institute for the launch of the latest special issue of our journal, International Development Policy, which focuses on the phenomenon commonly known as land grabbing, or large-scale land acquisition. I wish to also give a warm welcome to a few friends of our journal. I see two editorial board members, Patrick Osakwe and Jean-François Bayard. And also welcome, of course, the guest editors and the authors of our special issue, which I will introduce in a few minutes. My name is Gilles Carbonnier. I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal International Development Policy. And we have the pleasure to launch today the sixth special thematic issue, which, as I mentioned today, is entitled Large-Scale Land Acquisition, Focus on Southeast Asia. So I wish to say a few words about our journal before moving to the special issue and introducing the speakers who will then go more in depth into the substance of this special issue. International Development Policy is a peer-reviewed e-journal which is published by the Graduate Institute and is available online in open access. At least once a year we publish a special thematic issue in paper format, which is then published with Brill Niehoff as a publisher. Our contributors actually resemble our target audience. Many of our contributors are researchers, academics from the north and from the south, but they also include policymakers and practitioners as our targeted audience, which includes not only the academic community, but also policymakers and practitioners interested in critical international development policy issues. Next to our thematic issue, we also publish regular edition of our e-journal with peer-reviewed articles, as well as policy debates where an academic or a policymaker writes an initial provocative piece, and then we ask other stakeholders to react to that piece and to have a real debate on those special topics. And this debate is carried out then also with our audience, especially through social medias and with a blog. And you can see just above my head here a number of addresses where this takes place. Let me finally mention, last but not least, that we enjoy the generous financial support of the Swiss Development and Cooperation Agency, SDC, and I wish to thank SDC for its continuous support to the journal. Now, the genesis of our special issue that we are launching today actually draws back to the mid-2000s, and in particular 2008. You might remember that we faced a triple crisis: financial, energy and food crisis, with soaring commodity prices, including food export restrictions and food price hikes, which triggered a new wave of transnational large-scale land acquisitions, especially by net food importers concerned over food security. This, in turn, renewed interest in research on agrarian change and land grabbing in the academic community. We thus approached three experts, inviting them as guest editors to fill specific gaps in our understanding of large-scale land acquisition. And the three experts are the three special guest editors that we will hear today, with Peter Messerli, who is director of the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Bern, Christophe Golay, Research Fellow and Coordinator of the Project on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights at Geneva's Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, and Christophe Gironde, who is lecturer and researcher in development studies here at the Institute. I wish to commend the guest editors for the outcome, which in my view stands out in 4 major respects. First, the special issue provides a wide interdisciplinary perspective on large-scale land acquisitions, including history, sociology, economics, geography, and law. It is anchored in the fields of agrarian studies and development studies. Second, the special issue strikes a fine balance between theoretical reflections and the analysis of actual practice and field reality. Third, the volume offers a major collection of articles focusing on Southeast Asia, which is a region that has attracted so far relatively little or less attention than Africa, for instance. Fourth, the special issue analyzes land acquisition and agrarian change from a human rights perspective, which is quite novel and distinctive. After the introduction by the guest editors, we will hear 2 discussants who have kindly accepted to share their views and thoughts based on our special issue. We will hear Professor Shaila Seshia Galvin, Assistant Professor at our Department of Anthropology and Sociology of Development at the Institute, and Ben White, who is Emeritus Professor from the ISS, the famous International Institute of Social Studies, now with Erasmus University Rotterdam. A few words on the editorial process. Numerous chapters in our volume draw on a research project that has been funded by the Swiss Network for International Studies, the SNIS, and it refers to research carried out between 2012 and 2014 under the direction of the guest editors. We have invited other authors who have not been involved at all in this research project to provide additional perspective, especially from a historical perspective as well as a global perspective, looking also at investors and their own approach to the phenomenon. We have held an internal author workshop for internal peer review, followed by an external anonymous peer review process. I wish to thank the editorial team, and in particular Marie Tondal, who was the editorial manager during the whole process. And I wish to thank also Emmanuel Dallamule, who helped us as research and editorial assistants while he was successfully completing his PhD during the same period. We are glad to present today our latest issue, which fits nicely with our editorial policy, that is to publish interdisciplinary, cutting-edge research in the making, involving researchers from the North and the South, as well as policymakers and practitioners. We are happy to partner with the SNIS, the Swiss Network of International Studies, which supported the research project I just referred before. And I'm glad to give the floor now to Bernhard Furher, who is the director of the Swiss Network for International Studies. Bernhard, you have the floor.
Hello everyone, my name is Bernhard, and as a director of a funding agency, what's the guy doing up here when the research is over, right? You might ask. So let me just begin from the end. What I did this morning, I was struggling with a form which is provided by the Département d'Instruction Publique. Now what's that? That's the local canton of Geneva equivalent of the schooling ministry, okay? Now why would I do that? Because of our project. I call it our, although it's not really ours, we only funded it. But the project you're going to hear about is actually having yet another offspring. What's that? As you might know, this is the tip of what I call the academic output, right? It's the cream of what comes out of, amongst other things, as you mentioned, the project we initially financed. But there's other things that came out of it. There was a film that was being produced, a documentary, 30 minutes long, that has been shown in about 7 or 8 countries to over 1,000 people. That was the first offspring. Now, this first offspring led a lot of people to become interested in the subject, and quite frankly, one of them was a friend of mine, a teacher at the secondary level here in Geneva. He said, why don't you bring that into schoolrooms, classrooms here in Geneva? I said, let's try. So that is why I'm trying to figure out that form from the Département d'Instruction Publique in order to get yet another little offspring of this project into yet another different context. And I think this is why this project in particular has become one of the internal, we're not officially allowed to say that, but one of the internal Chéri project, because it has really lived up to what we have as a core mission, which is basically funding research that transcends borders in the literal and in the figurative sense. So it goes beyond disciplines, but it also goes beyond this kind of academia practitioner drift. And so I'm very happy that not only did it produce the immediate results that we as a funder expected, it also produced this high quality academic output. It produced a documentary film, and it also will, I hope, produce schooling material for Geneva and hopefully Swiss pupils. I think for me, this is really exemplary, that a project can have so many different outputs under so many different forms. And I'm happy that today here I'll be able to listen into the academic side, but I just wanted you to know there are so many different aspects of this project which have actually taken place. And with this, I would like to give the floor so that you can finally hear about the content. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Bernhard. Now I call on the 3 guest editors to join me on the panel and to start the presentations. I don't know how you have decided to organize yourselves, so... Okay, that you go first. Very good. So Christophe Gironde goes first.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, great. Thanks, Bernhard, for reminding us that it's now, what, 4 years old project? Did we apply in 2010 or 11? Anyway, never-ending thanks to the SNIS for its support for providing the core of the financial resources for the project. Also because when you get a big piece of funding, you manage much more easily to get additional bits and pieces which we got from various sources. Also, I would like to thank the PolDev. They are not all here, those I wanted to thank, but thank Gilles on behalf of Peter and Christophe for trusting us, giving us the opportunity to do this issue. And also for the, I must say, it's not a courtesy because you're my colleague, very, very good conditions. I think that there are not that many people who can do this work, having a workshop at the early stage where we could be gathered for 2 days and a half, with all the authors coming from all over the world. It's quite unique. I think that I know many of the authors were really amazed by this. So thanks. We just hope it's going to continue in terms of budget. A word for Professor Ben White. Thanks for joining, engaging, and providing very precious advice, ideas. It's a great contribution. It's also been a great pleasure to be working with you and meeting you in several other instances. I must pay tribute to the most senior of the author, Professor Marcel Mazoyer, and his colleague, Laurence Roudard, who opened the issue with historical chapter. We had discussed this. It was very strong from Gilles that we needed this. We wanted him. We wanted them. And so they opened the issue, and it's very rich. I won't go through all of it. But 2 main messages, lessons. First, they recalled that large-scale land acquisition is We knew that, not a new phenomenon, but that it's a recurrent phenomenon. And I think that this is crucial because it's recurrent. We must understand where, how, from who comes the current one, and we must dig into the past. When it comes to the outcomes and consequences for populations, the history of large-scale land acquisition and the type of agricultural system which is associated to it is a story of, as they say, large number of people being dispossessed from their land, from their labor, from their livelihood, and a limited number of those we can call the beneficiaries of this type of investment and this type of agriculture. This is true, they explain, of the latifundia system back to the Roman Empire. This is true of the more well-known, for us scholars, enclosures in Britain in the 16th century. And this applies to the various episodes, cases of colonization and post-colonial colonization, land colonization. Laurent Spoder and Marcel Mazoyer recall us also the fact that those processes are strongly associated to not really democratic regime, but rather dictatorships. And I guess that Christophe will elaborate on this because we hope democracy can improve the situation. There are 3 chapters who address the question of the consequences. They differ in their approach, in their concept, in their methods, and in their views. The first one is what is usually called an impact study, based from study carried out by UNCTAD and the World Bank on the gains and risk, I quote the vocabulary, very specific, that how they are perceived by the stakeholders. And this story concludes rather optimistically, that a set of more inclusive business is now emerging. The 2 other pieces or the chapters are more nuanced. Case study in Luzon, Philippines, and Aceh, Indonesia. The main message is that it's actually difficult to set up a business model because on the ground, investment turned to be quite different from what was planned. They draw attention on the tensions, on the conflict that go together, the process of acquisition, investment, and the development of large-scale agriculture. And the last chapter, which is on southern Laos and northern Cambodia, shows that the vulnerability had already started before land was dealt, land was leased to outsiders. So it's not only the impact after, but it's also something that happened before the land acquisition process. And we conclude, because I'm part of this study, less optimistically because we found that out-migration for the local population is probably one of the best opportunity, if I may say so, for the local populations which are now impacted by these large-scale investments. Please.
So hi everyone. So I also want to thank everybody, Gilles and the whole team, and Marie was there, and Bernhard, Furher, and my co-editors. So we've worked together since 2011. We've tried to do some interdisciplinary work, which is not easy. So with political economist, social geographer, and human rights specialist. So I think we have done lots of pluridisciplinary work. We have done lots of pluridisciplinary work. The first year was about that. We also published articles in journal. I did one, for example, on the human rights response to land grabbing, and others did also publish articles. So we did lots of disciplinary work, and we've tried with this book and also in the working paper, the last report to the SNIS, to do some interdisciplinary work. But it's not easy.
One of the ways to do it was to see the impact of large-scale land acquisitions on local populations. And of course, Gironde was studying that impact from a livelihood perspective. And I was studying the same impact from a human rights perspective. So we tried to do interdisciplinary work on the cases on which we worked, from a livelihood perspective to study the impact, and from a human rights perspective. So he has described a bit some of the impact from a livelihood perspective. What we have seen from a human rights perspective is different kind of violations. And one is, for example, the fact that people are forcibly evicted or displaced from their land, which implies many human rights violations, because then they will not have any more access to many things, including access to health services or education or many other things. And of course, they will not have access also to food and water, for example. So that's one example of violations that we have seen in the two countries in which we did research, in Cambodia and Laos. Another one is what we call the process rights, like consultation, information, participation, the rights of indigenous peoples to be informed and consulted before something is done on their land, for example. We also have seen that people didn't receive compensation in many cases for the loss of their land, which was another type of violations of human rights. So that's like how we try to work together in an interdisciplinary manner on the same cases from a livelihood and human rights perspective. So then we have 3 articles in this book which are human rights based, let's say, and we have one publication that is online. It's the beginning of the online debate on this topic, and it's a paper by the Milun Kotari, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. And he did something on the usefulness of the guidelines he published in 2007, so it's already 8 years ago, and how these guidelines were used to fight against the phenomenon of large-scale land acquisitions. So if you want, you also have another paper that is available online, and it's the beginning of a debate on the usefulness of these kind of soft law instruments, guidelines, human rights instruments in response to land grabbing and large-scale land acquisitions. So the UN system has done many things in response to large-scale land acquisitions from a human rights perspective. The Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Scoeter, who also wrote a chapter in this book, presented 11 principles that should be respected in large-scale land acquisitions: consultation of population, again, information, respect of the ILO instruments in terms of work, the fact that the right to food should be protected by producing the food locally and use it for the local consumption, part of the food at least. So just few examples of what he has done in these principles. Then lots of treaty bodies, it's called, experts of the UN based in Geneva, human rights experts, monitoring the situation in many, many countries, have done lots of recommendations to states based on the violations that they have identified, very similar violations to what we have seen in the field: forced eviction, no consultation, no compensation, etc. And then they have recommended, for example, to Cambodia, to Laos, to Vietnam, to Myanmar, etc., lots of things that should be done to respect the rights of the people during large-scale land acquisitions. Anyway, so we have seen a match of what we could see in the field in terms of violations and what was identified by the UN experts in Geneva. Now, are human rights useful in the field? That was also one of the questions. And I think it was very different in the two countries in which we did study. I mean, in Laos, it's extremely difficult to evaluate that because you cannot really talk about human rights. There is no human rights organization. So that's something that is extremely difficult. Two people who tried to at least criticize the state. One was kicked off of the country, the former country director of Helvetas in December 2012. The other, Sombat, a local activist, disappeared. So it's very difficult to work on human rights and rights-based activism in Laos. It's very different in Cambodia, where you have lots of human rights NGOs. The two main ones, Likado and ADOC, are working a lot on land grabbing.
So you have lots of materials, you have NGOs. You also have a UN special rapporteur on Cambodia. So there was one person who was reporting every year on human rights in Cambodia, and he did a whole report in 2012 on land grabbing. So we have a basis in Cambodia to work. But even there, are human rights useful? We have one article in this book by Joanna Sismas and Patricia Paramita on the use of human rights in Cambodia, and they compare what can happen in a village in a rural area where people don't use human rights, don't know about human rights, and have no affiliation or contact with NGOs, and and they compare that with a situation in Phnom Penh, with more than 4,000 people who were threatened to be evicted because of a development project, and they did use human rights. They had a lot of links with NGOs, human rights NGOs. They used the World Bank inspection panel, etc. And at the end, it had an impact. So anyway, that's one prism that we can use, and one differentiation that we can use to see how we can use. That resonates with something that Sofia Monsalve Suarez, an expert on the topic, wrote a few years ago on the conditions for human rights to be useful, and that's the fact that people know about their rights, they have access to NGOs or people who can use litigation or advocacy work to promote the rights. Last word on the article by Olivier de Scoter on the right to property. So there is a chapter on the right to property in which he's describing how the right to property has been proposed as a response to protect land tenure of populations since 30 or 40 years, and the impact it can have on the population. That's something that we saw in Cambodia again, where there was a land law since 2001 that protects many ways of having land tenure, and really one was implementing that, and that's giving economic land concessions, was really promoted in Cambodia. But not the collective titles for indigenous peoples, for example. Only 3 indigenous communities got access to land in the last 10 years. But lots of companies got economic land concessions. And that's, of course, due to a pressure from the society or the groups to have their rights realized and implemented. So that's the land law is not bad in itself. I mean, it could protect indigenous peoples. It could also lead to more large-scale land acquisitions, and it did lead to more large-scale land acquisitions because of who is putting pressure on the government at the national or local level. So that's just one example, and that's what Olivier shows, that there are different ways of protecting land tenure. One is individual property, and one is, for example, collective property, and that's individual property that was really promoted in the last years. And that should not be the case if you want to protect the right to food, for example. Anyway, that's just for the presentation of a few of the chapters that we have in this book. Thank you.
Okay. Good, thank you very much. And also hello from my side. I don't extend the thanks, but I'm really grateful for a very nice collaboration, which was clearly led by the Institute and the guys, and I'm very grateful for that, and very happy that we have this nice book. Sorry, it's not a book, it's a special issue, I learned, at hand, and I'm very happy about that. Good. Gilles Carbonnier has already said it is an issue about Southeast Asia, which comes timely because we sometimes lack information on this region. And I think when looking at it, it's clear that when local contexts are unavoidably linked to the global power asymmetries, then we have a lot of phenomena happening, and that is really happening very quickly in Southeast Asia. So I'm really grateful to have that. But when browsing the book today and yesterday in the night again, I thought, did we really choose the right title? Is it about large-scale land acquisitions? Because I think the claim is beyond acquiring land. It's really also about re-evaluating rural rural spheres in the global south. It's much more than that. So the claim is more, I would also say the mechanism is clearly more than acquisition. It's also about governments governing their land, new land policy. It's about trade, it's a globalized trade network. So many more mechanisms. And also the outcomes, it's clearly more than changed livelihood or agrarian transition. It's really also about sectoral transitions in a world where the division of labor is progressing much more and hence commodificating the land. So these were my thoughts, but I thought perhaps this is not really the case because my worry is actually rather, I think large-scale land acquisitions are just a perfect example to get ready as science, get ready, get fit to tackle these very challenging issues. And so I had rather three reflections if we really learned our lesson. Did we get fit? And let me share three thoughts about that. The first is about interdisciplinarity, as you did as well. The second is more about the normative dimension of development, because we're dealing about a normative setting. And the third is a little bit about this tension between doing context justice on the one hand and doing generalization and theory building justice on the other hand. So very short, three thoughts to each of them. In terms of interdisciplinarity, I think we clearly fulfilled that we have multiple dimensions. For example, there is the work of Zahn, I think, of UNCTAD. Sorry? James Zahn, with his huge empirical work, having large samples and looking for correlations between business models and their impact on local communities. And he comes up with some very nice correlations between, and he can say something about that. And on the other end of the spectrum, I think we have the work of, I have to see, Sohibuddin, I think in the Sweet and Bitter, where he dissects really the complex processes of decision-making about these land deals, choosing this very process-specific perspective. And I think these are really two very complementary views, but I don't think that the results really fit together. Of course, we still talk about land use, large-scale land acquisitions, but if we scratch a little bit beyond the synthesis that we do around a beer in the evening, I would say we understand that we have totally different methodologies, and it's not even enough. We don't share the same concepts. We don't even share the same epistemologies. So when we talk about causalities, I think there are huge differences between these two worlds. And when I observe now this book, I think there are two remarkable sources of really interdisciplinary work. That's when we give ourselves into either a historical, focus or to a place-based focus. And in the historical focus, I see also Hudar and Mawaize, there I see different perspectives coming together on this nexus between land and labor and power. It's really a nice perspective. Or on the other side, I see on the place-based things, for example, in your work, Christophe, I see interdisciplinary work using mixed methods on looking at these livelihood transitions and using these meta concepts such as livelihoods or that really help to steer this interdisciplinary work. And I would also say in our work when we try to link place and patterns of processes together, we try to do it as well. So some remarks on that. I think there is still a long way to go, just doing good interdisciplinary work. Second, on the normative dimension of it, I see two big strands of it, and I would say one is really more the social critical science strand, which I would entitle explicitly implicit, something like that. and more the evidence, the neo-positivist science, which we also have a couple of work to it, which I would perhaps call explicitly avoiding it or something like that. What I try to say is that, of course, this critical rationalism tries to, of course, keep the normative dimension out of science, having the facts, then you judge what is really good and bad about land. Let's not call it land grabbing, let's call it land acquisitions. And the critical science, of course, they reveal the winners and losers of these processes, but it's not very clear to what normative references we refer to, what is the position and what is development and modernity. And so a lot of questions. Then I thought it was really refreshing to have the human rights-based approach as a clear reference of the normative dimension, and that's in your work very nicely done, I think. But also, as a complement, then I could say, the work by Sismas and all, showing also the limitations of inducing transformation with a human rights-based approach as a very difficult endeavor. Good, I think there is more to do on this normative dimension, and speaking for a sustainable development-oriented land scientist, what I would call myself, I think we have to be more explicit about what is really systems knowledge, where we describe processes and dynamics, when we talk about the target knowledge, who sets the targets, the values, what direction shall development go, and then really also giving space for transformation approaches and knowledge how transformation can be achieved. And I think the SDG reference is an additional help in this process in the future. So the final remark, in my too long, Gilles, I know. Good, the final remark regarding this issue about context and generalization. And of course, for us, it's all clear, context matters. We have to zoom in if we want to integrate different perspectives, if we want to choose holistic approaches, taking the normative dimension. And also sustainability is always something which is negotiated in concrete political, social context. We cannot come out of the context. But on the other hand of things, I think generalization is a genuine science interest, is to generalize, to zoom out, to compare, to build theory. And I think also from this project point of view, it's necessary because decisions and policies are made beyond the local context. So we have to zoom out. It must be our duty to balance the context with this. And looking at this tension between two, I think we did quite good work on these issues. Again, on generalizations, you have mentioned it, Christophe, in the historical perspectives about the beneficiaries and the dispossessed. I think we have learned about that business models play a role in terms of the community impacts, that outgrower schemes perform generally better, also environmentally. I think in our work we have tried to link, we call that archetypes, through meta-analysis of case studies. Can we come up with recurring processes of decision-making that can be generalized and possibly even linked to the outcomes they produce? So that we, from our side, can say, if we observe a certain pattern of outcomes, is it a proximate indicator for what was happening in terms of decision-making? That was our intention, and I think also you, Christophe, Gironde, I think with the typology of impacts, you really had a nice generalization effort there on looking at different types of impacts. So I think it's a must. We have to work on generalization, on theory building, and so on. But even if this is hard, I would say there is something which is even harder, and that's going the other way around. Going from the theory back to the context and saying, what is different than what we expected, especially if we think about the transformation-oriented research. And in this context, I would particularly like to highlight, I think, two articles in this volume. One is Olivier Descouter's work, where he says, this notion of land titling that is not a silver bullet in its most simple way, but the transposition of this Western conception of ownership into such a debate, how we can totally fail and produce exactly the other outcome. I think that was a remarkable paper. And I would also say the paper of Dwyer and all on this leopard skin approach, where he shows that well-intended investments in terms of certification and regulation around these better practices, that they also actually, in a local context, suddenly produce totally different outcomes. So I think this tension between context and generalization is absolutely key, and we should continue work on that. So I'm done. I want to say again, I think there is a wealth of information in this book. I recommend you to read it, to read some parts of it. I would also say there is a lot of room for improvement still, of being better around the topics I just said. And I don't know the title of the next book yet, but so I think we have some time to figure it out because we can still do some improvements along these lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the guest editors. I will ask now the panelists to do some gymnastics, in a sense that they will make room for our two discussants, and I invite the two discussants on stage, which I introduced before. And I don't know whether you discussed between yourselves who would go first. Else? Yeah, Shaila. So as you wish, if you prefer to be here. Shaila, you have the floor.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you to the guest editors for the opportunity to join in this conversation. I've certainly learned a great deal from reading the contributions in the volume. I want to use my role as discussant today to do a couple of things. First, to highlight briefly what I think and what I take to be the strengths and the originality of this volume. And second, to flag a few issues that could be the subject for further discussion or possibly development. I agree with Gilles Carbonnier that what is unique and remarkable about this special issue is the diversity of the contributors, the scope and the range of the research methods that are used, and the shared regional focus of many of the core chapters. To me, what stood out is that the contributors themselves include senior academics and policymakers, as well as young scholars and PhD candidates, and that they're based in institutions that span Europe, the United States, Laos, Cambodia, and Indonesia. Together, they bring an impressive breadth of disciplinary perspectives and approaches that may be challenging at times, and these range, as we've heard, from single or comparative case studies to larger scale assessments or analytic frameworks. Amidst this diversity, what the contributions also share is a recognition, I think at least individually, of generalizing in a superficial way about the dynamics of large-scale land acquisitions in terms of both the forms they take and their outcomes. But nonetheless, most authors try in some way to grapple with this challenge and to work to better understand in a systematic way the complexity and variety of large-scale land acquisitions. So as we've heard, Messerli and his co-authors work to identify and systematize some of the key factors that shape particular outcomes. And Gironde and Portilla use a comparative study of Laos and Cambodia to show how, despite significant differences in historical and political contexts, similarities do exist in terms of the ways in which rural lives and livelihoods are being transformed by land acquisitions in these countries. But the issues that I'd like to raise for discussion are really targeted more, I think, at drawing out some of the potential connections among the individual contributions. These relate to the regional perspective of the volume, the role of the state, and the integration of political economy or agrarian studies or livelihoods perspectives with human rights approaches to land acquisitions. So I hope that these will complement what's already been said by the guest editors. Among the striking features of the volume, I think, is its focus on Southeast Asia, and we've heard how Southeast Asia has been perhaps understudied when compared to Africa and Latin America in relation to land acquisitions or land grabbing. Although there have been several special issues on this general subject of land grabs or land acquisitions published in recent years, I think it's much more rare to have a volume that does have a regional focus. So my question then for the editors is how the experience of the countries of Southeast Asia, and particularly Laos and Cambodia, which are well represented in the volume, are distinctive from other regions of the world. Messerli observes, for example, that large-scale land acquisitions in Southeast Asia are regional rather than global, and this marks one difference from LSLAs in Latin America or Africa. And this seems to me to be an important observation, especially when so much of the conversation around land acquisitions is centered on an opposing notion of the local and the global. So extending this, how might a regionally grounded perspective on land acquisitions nuance broader conceptualizations? Thinking through the phenomenon of land acquisitions at a regional level, it seems, I think, is also an important step to connecting individual case studies to what Gilles Carbonnier called the macro understanding of dynamics. Let let's see. Such a perspective would treat the region not simply as a way of delimiting geographic or spatial boundaries, but as the focus for historical, political, and economic analysis. And it seems to me that further steps could be taken in this direction. For example, building on the historical chapter that opens the volume, I'd be interested to hear about the specificities of the regional histories of land acquisition and agrarian change within Southeast Asia. Continuing to think along regional lines, I also want to take up the question of the state, which in their conclusion, Gironde and Golay flag as a key but sometimes neglected actor in land acquisition processes. The state is present in all of the chapters in this volume as an actor within the international context of security mercantilism, in the figures of various government ministers or field-level bureaucrats. And perhaps because of my anthropological background, I'm inclined to see the state not as a monolithic entity with singular interests, but as an internally differentiated or even fragmented amalgam of different bureaucratic, political, and administrative units that do not necessarily cohere, but that may compete or contradict each other. And so if the outcomes of large-scale land acquisitions are importantly shaped on the ground at the local level, as some of the contributions suggest, then I'd like to hear more about the local, the municipal, or the provincial state in Southeast Asia. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, the diversity of perspectives and the methodologies produce some terrific synergies. But I think they also leave some unanswered questions. And one of them, as we've heard, is the integration of political economy or livelihoods perspectives with human rights-based approaches. So how in practice are human rights discourses used? By whom? In what contexts? And for what purposes? Under what kinds of conditions do rights-based challenges become locally meaningful? And certainly one question I was left with is that given the fact that other forms of rights, entitlements, and customary practices, particularly those related to land, as we see in this volume, seem so often not to be recognized by state actors, what hope is there that a human rights-based struggle would fare any differently? So these are just a few of the questions that I'll put out, and I'm sure there'll be many more, but thank you again.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's going to be difficult to find something to say that hasn't already been said about the book. I will continue to call it a book, a special book. Anyway, thanks very much to the Graduate Institute for the invitation, and I was very happy to have been able to play a small part in the earlier stages of the production of this book. I've been involved for several years in something called the Land Deals Politics Initiative, which is a group of actually just 5 people who we've got together funds to provide small grants to encourage especially young researchers to do engaged research on the global land grab. And we sponsored several international and regional conferences, all of which have resulted in one or more special issues on large-scale land acquisitions. And if you look at the way this type of publication has been going, they have been going more in the direction of specialization. So the last one that I was involved in was one on political responses from below, so resistance from below to land grabs. I'm now working on one on the gender and the generational dimensions of land grabs, so that's one direction. Now, the editors of this book have gone the other way to a broad spectrum approach, and one might have been somewhat doubtful about its the usefulness of it, But I think they have actually shown us that they are right, and I'd like to congratulate the editors, the two Christophs and Peter, on what they have done. It's much more than just another collection of case studies. It has some very specific contributions to make, which we've already heard about. The encouragement to step back and take a longer-term historical perspective, a welcome focus on the land grabbers, in this case the role of states, the subcluster of case studies on Southeast Asia, each with their different frameworks from micro-political economy and land science to best practice and human rights, and the general critical reflections on the globalization of private property rights and possible alternatives to this. I can't comment on each of the chapters in turn, so I'll just focus on a few. But first of all, I'd like again to go back to the historical chapter of Laurence Roudard and Marcel Mazoyer, which has really challenged us to think about the historical role of large-scale land acquisitions and of the forms of agriculture which they promote. And they argue that historically, whether we talk of the Roman Republic, the British enclosures, haciendas and fazendas in the Americas, Soviet collectivization, colonial land grabs, they have all involved expulsion of local populations, failure to provide employment to the majority of those who are dispossessed, very poor working conditions and low levels of income for those incorporated, and at the same time benefiting a very small number of individuals who sometimes become extremely rich. But it also ends on a refreshing, optimistic note, noting that in the past, these distortions in land tenure caused by large-scale land grabs have often been corrected by redistributive land reforms, aiming to promote a return to relatively egalitarian, smallholder-based farming regimes. So their study actually embodies an implicit hope that large-scale, corporate, industrial, earth-warming farming in future will become a thing of the past. Looking to the future, then, it's not out of the question that movements from below and consequent pressures on governments for agrarian reforms, together with common sense thinking about appropriate agricultural futures, might result in the grabbing back of corporately grabbed lands by local communities. It's already been mentioned that the book embodies mixed approaches, mixed methods, from detailed local case studies to meta-analysis. It also, as Peter has stressed, embodies implicitly a variety of different policy perspectives. There are two chapters which basically suggest that large-scale corporate land acquisitions are fine, but need to follow the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of land tenure. There are some others which show how these guidelines are systematically violated and are unlikely to be followed in any foreseeable future. And there are still others that are more or less telling us that with or without such guidelines, large-scale corporate agriculture should have no place in a future agriculture that is in line with sustainable development goals. So, while not having time to discuss the detailed local case studies, I do just want to say that this is not because they're not important. Case study researchers are the foot soldiers in the battle for knowledge and understanding of how large-scale land deals actually work. And without good case studies, there can be no good meta-analysis. The perspective on the role of states in international agro-investments, specifically the Gulf states and China's role, is very well presented in the chapter by Eckhard Wurtz and Martin Kohlertz. And they frame this in a food regimes discourse, which actually doesn't have to be a food regimes discourse, it can be an agro-commodity regimes discourse. And this focus on the role of states actually does raise questions about the claim of Philip McMichael and others that we are now into a third world food regime in which states have been superseded as the main actors by transnational companies. In some parts of the global agro-commodity system, at least, states are still very important. this neoliberal world that we are always talking about is in many aspects a bit less neoliberal than we seem to think it is. The summary by Olivier de Schutter of various critiques of land titling schemes which privilege private individual property in land, I think is a very important contribution to our growing knowledge that creating markets for land rights is not a road to ensuring security of tenure, and indeed it often has the opposite effect. It's therefore very important to look, as he does in the last part of his chapter, to alternatives to the commodification of land through globalizing property rights. And that is an important and, in my view, a still unanswered question for policy and for rural people and rural social movements once the arguments against private individual property rights are accepted. I'll come back to that later if there's time. I found the chapter by Michael Dwyer and his colleagues on best, or what they call better practices, with the various cases that they have mentioned there, also very useful. Large-scale land deals in Southeast Asia, as in most parts of the world, actually are made not between investors and those who currently occupy the land and use it, but between corporations and governments, even though who claim the right to ownership of this land, even though they may have never claimed it in practice or been active in managing this supposed property of theirs. And so in this context, they explore these two best practice cases, or better practice in their words, of concessions which have attempted to follow the government's, the so-called leopard skin policy, leaving existing smallholders in place rather than pursuing evictions. So we actually see two cases of investors who are actually trying to do the right thing and trying to reduce the chances of conflict with local communities. So this is potentially very interesting and relevant for policy debates. But if this better practice is the best we can hope for, the future is not very bright for local populations affected by the activities of corporate land investors in these expanding commodity frontiers. I found, like others, the two chapters on human rights very useful, especially for those who are not so familiar with this field. In most countries, international conventions and soft law guidelines, like the voluntary guidelines, provide a good basis, and they are generally reflected more or less in national laws, perhaps not in Laos, but they are poorly implemented or not implemented, allowing widespread human rights violations, as the last part of Christophe Golay's paper shows. And the chapter after that by Iona Kismas and Patricia Paramita gives further details of the problems that affected communities have in mobilizing human rights discourse to legitimate their claims. I just want in the last part actually to go back to the historical chapter. Yeah? At the end of their paper, Roudard and Mazoyer raised the big question, and I'm quoting, which production structures are better capable of encouraging sustained development, primarily aimed at reducing poverty, generating jobs and livelihoods for hundreds of millions of people, promoting growth, providing food security for all, and reducing income disparities while enhancing the environment. This actually makes us think whether large-scale corporate farms are needed at all in this world, since actually all major crops, which provide the world with its food, its livestock feed, its fuel, and its fibers, can and are being grown successfully and efficiently by smallholders. So this actually should lead us, maybe for the next book, to consider the question, if we think about Southeast Asia, what kind of farms, a generation from now, will provide Southeast Asia's growing population and the other populations to whom it exports agricultural products, with its need for food and other agricultural products? Will they be small holdings, by which I mean holdings that are held by individuals rather than corporations, managed by people who also work on them, with or without some hired help? Or will we see an increasing dominance of large-scale, corporate, heavily mechanized agriculture? It's not only peasant movements and romantics who argue that smallholder farming can feed the world. We're not talking of some romantic, some milk puddingy kind of vision of a return to traditional subsistence farming. Southeast Asian smallholders historically have been very eager to engage in smallholder commodity production when given a chance and if supported by government policies. They all want to have smartphones and motorbikes and televisions, and this is the way that they can do it. There is growing scientific consensus on the potentials for high productivity, resilient smallholder farming using less industrial and more agroecological practices if adequately supported. Now, of course, there are economies of scale in the agricultural sector, but these economies of scale, they are needed and they are realized not on farms, but in some of the activities upstream and downstream from farms, in domestic or global agricultural commodity chains. So all this means that if one thinks of supporting a better future for smallholder farming, smallholders, of course, must have security of tenure. And this is why Olivier de Schutter's paper is so important. While land laws and peasant movements agree on this principle, it's not always clear exactly what kind of land tenure regimes land reforms and peasant movements actually want in terms of concrete tenure systems. So we need to think of alternatives to what are currently the two dominant forms of non-corporate land tenure promoted by agrarian movements: private individual land ownership on the one hand and customary or communal tenure on the other, since both of these actually, in my view, are part of the problem rather than the solution. Both customary and private property tenure systems, they tend to disadvantage women. They make it difficult for would-be farmers to acquire farmland while they're still young, and they both result in rural societies quite different from the egalitarian smallholder communities envisioned by land laws and agrarian movements. So I just want to finish by asking, what should be our principal criteria for the development of alternative land tenure regimes, better suited to present and future challenges and the needs of smallholder farming communities? Well, everyone will make their own list of criteria. I'll just mention some of mine. They should prioritize smallholder farming and the land to the tiller principle as a general principle. They should provide the users of land as right holders with secure tenure, but they must ensure that land does not become an object of speculation or accumulation, so not private property tenure. They must allow for regulation of access rights in flexible and adaptable ways that also can adapt to changes in local conditions. They must ensure and protect women's equal rights to land. They must deal with generational tensions, enabling young would-be farmers to access land while they're still young. And finally, they must not require a huge national and/or regional bureaucracy to implement and enforce them. So this, to me, is one of the main challenges to visions of a global agriculture which promotes rather than constrains the achievement of sustainable development goals. So this, I think, is one direction in which our inquiries might go in the future. Thank you very much.
Let me thank both of our discussants, Professor Galvin and Professor White, very warmly for your thoughtful reactions, remarks on the book or the volume, and also your numerous questions and areas for further research that you have highlighted. What I propose now is to continue a bit of gymnastics to have our four guest editors actually back on the panel, and then we have about 20 minutes left. So if our guest editors agree, what I propose is to open the floor and collect a number of comments and reactions, and then we will go back to you for reactions to what the discussants have been saying, and also a number of questions and remarks that are very specific, but also take this opportunity to address some of the questions that the audience will have raised, and conclude, because we have to conclude at about 2 p.m. So who would like to start with a comment or question? Yes, we have 2, so we can start here and then Lisa and then here. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Barbara McCallin. I'm a consultant on forced displacement and housing, land, property issues. And I used to work with the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, so that's why my question will be linked to the human rights dimension of your work. I think it's Mr. Christophe Golay who was referring to it. When you were looking at the human rights dimension, did you look also at the impact it has on, in terms of forced displacement? You said you looked at forced evictions, but do you have any information as to the type of displacement it creates? Is it a short-term displacement? Is it long-term? Is it short distance or long distance? And have you been in any way able to quantify this forced displacement impact? Thank you.
Okay, thank you to take down the question. We have another intervention by Professor Prugel, and then Professor Prugel, and then...
Hello, thank you very much for this presentation. I have to ask the gender question. I know all 3 of you are really fascinated by that topic, and didn't address it. Thank you very much for Ben White to bring up the issue of the complications that result sometimes from small-scale farming and small enterprises that essentially operate on the basis of women's free labor. I wanted to ask you, if you were to redo the SNIS project through a gender lens, what kind of questions would you ask? And I'd like to connect to that. Okay, very often we think of gender issues as something having situated in the household, but is there something outside the household that we should be looking at? Gilles Carbonnier started off talking about the multiple crises. You didn't mention the care crisis. In part, of course, we don't have any statistics on this, and that's one of the complications. But is there another global care crisis? And if we look at the world from that perspective of also putting reproduction in focus, how would land commercialization, agrarian change, does that tell us anything about the way in which we might want to reorganize the world to account for care issues?
We have
Hello, I'm Christophe from the Global Footprint Network here in Geneva, and I have a question about the environmental impact of those large-scale land acquisition. I didn't hear much about it during, but I came a bit late, I'm sorry for that, during the deliberation now, and I was wondering whether it's an off-center question, or whether it could fit into your interdisciplinary framework. I'm just adding that I feel a bit, I don't know how to express, I feel a bit guilty, because we had been invited to participate in this book, but we had to conclude that our main instruments we're dealing with were not able to produce such environmental balance about large-scale land acquisitions.
Okay, I propose to come back to the panel and start maybe this time with Peter Messerli, and then we'll go to each. So I don't know if you could hand over the mic to Peter so that you could start by addressing both some of the discussants' comments as well as questions from the floor from the audience you'd like to address.
Okay, I'll try to go across, and I would still start with a comment Shaila made in her discussion note about the state and, being a conflictuous or fragmented amalgamate of rather than unit. And I would say from our perspective in this research, the underlying case studies, which were not actually each published in the work, but which were underlying this more generalized chapter, I think clearly showed the very different entities of the state, on the one hand being in a horizontal level or being sectorially totally fragmented. That's one thing. And I would say also the very blurred boundaries between state agents and their collaboration, also with NGOs. And so it's very difficult to really say, for example, for Laos, where I know it better, who is the Laos state? This question to answer would be extremely difficult. And I think there also what you mentioned, now to the regional perspective on it, I think there the historical perspective proved to be a key issue. For example, the blind confidence of Laos, also farmers, but state agents, to the Vietnamese interventions, just because they're considered as brothers, historical brothers in arms and whatever. That played such a big role in giving the confidence to these investors, which of course they learned better after a while, but that was, so these issues are very important, I think, and to a certain degree could also be researched further also in a more systematic way than just in this more anecdotal matter of these 28 case studies that we had. And trying to go over to the question about the gender lens, of course, if you're saying beyond household, beyond disaggregate data and so on, I'm perhaps not the right person to answer. What I think is, or to my perception, I think this issue of sectorial transitions becomes very key on the one hand, going from agriculture into labor, into other jobs, and there the gender issues become very key. Who has access to land, who is providing the income, and how does the care issue then result of the two? And saying what are the really, who is benefiting from these processes and who is losing, and I think also the work there by Rig I thought was quite interesting, hinting to other contexts like Indonesia and saying, why do we have this fascination on having access to land? It's actually the people who lost access who are now much better off in certain countries in Southeast Asia because they were forced to move out of agriculture sector. So quite provoking thesis there, I would say, which also play into the gender dimensions. But I think more can come. On the environment, yes, I think that is a bit of a lacking perspective, and that was clearly also an intention, and it was explicitly made, at least in the project that was submitted to SNIS as a donor. This is where we drew the line in terms of being, not falling into the overall holistic trap of having all dimensions into it, and that also in terms of resources was a decision. Nevertheless, I would say, looking at the land use changes that we did in our component of the project, there was a lot of environmental aspects coming into it because we could show, for example, in what land use types these different acquisitions are happening. So one of the findings was that most of the foreign and not domestic investors in Laos and mainly also Cambodia are going into forestry-related produces. That means rubber and eucalyptus and pulp and so on. And they're doing that mostly actually in forest or in former forested areas. So that in Cambodia, deforestation rates are huge. In Laos, it's more the former shifting cultivation context. And there I would say they're also entering into conflict with local populations, clearly above the World Bank figures of what they call marginal lands by 25 persons per square kilometer. So it's much higher, it's 60, 70 persons per square kilometer. The conflict is there, but there is an enormous conflict also with global public goods in terms of biodiversity, carbon, and so on. So that issue, of course, comes up indirectly, but we have not provided, primary data and evidence on that. These are a few.
Okay. First, I would like to reply to Shaila's comment. I certainly cannot compare Southeast Asia to the two other, let's say, large areas that are Africa and Latin America. Probably we should ask Ben, who has something like 20 years more experience. But on the regional dimension, it's clearly very strongly embedded in sub-regional Mekong Lower Region politics. Just to take a very concrete case, we did the movie and the last piece of field research during summer 2013, at the time of the highly contested presidential election in Cambodia. And the morning after the contested elections, there were Vietnamese troops at the main crosses in Phnom Penh. There's very, very clear support from Vietnam to Hun Sen, although Vietnam is the main threat on Cambodian natural resources. There's also what Peter mentioned, the use of this so-called friendship, historical friendship, referring back to let's fight the French out. There's a regional institution called the Triangle, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam Triangle, which is an interministerial body, high rank, high level. I don't know exactly the status, but it clearly creates the condition for Vietnam to institutionalize some of its domination on the two other countries. Second, the national dimension of large-scale land acquisition is very strong in Cambodia. If you look at the distribution of economic land concession in percentage of the total, the first owners are the Khmer companies, Khmer individuals, the local, national elite, high-rank people from the government, the police, the army, and etc. Also, if you look back prior to the official economic land concession, you see the development of the concession economy back to the end of the Red Khmer regime, going through the forestry concession, then the land titling, I should not call them program, they were not program, but practice, that has created much of the acquisition prior to the real official by the law one. All this is very Cambodian story before all, I would say. Yes, there are also many Chinese concessions and Vietnamese, but if you look over time, the first were the Khmer ones. But I'm not trying to minimize them, but that's the way historically it has happened. Second, Shaila, you had a remark about the state being not monolithic. Fully agree. I take the case of the chief of the commune, one of the commune where we worked the most, where we did the movie, and is for sure it belongs to this constellation or coalition of powers, coalition with the outsiders, investors, Chinese, Vietnamese, Khmer, etc. But is also a piece of developmental state. As he explained, it's his interest to contribute to the development of rubber, that's rubber in this case. So he's really contributing to local development. He made Nursery Main come to settle in this commune. Sure, he gave land, he got something in exchange. We could see this as just pure corruption and affairs, but he does contribute. And he's also, the chief of the village, is also part of the local elite. He has become a modern farmer. He has the car, he has all what we have here. Then I wanted to say a word on the question on dispossession. What we have tried in the case of Cambodia is to set up a typology of dispossession, and with one type being what we call extreme dispossession, which includes the loss of all, not only the land, but also the houses, the trees around the house, and including relocation. Well, I don't know if relocation seems too clean as a concept. We did qualitative work to draw this typology, but we did not carry out questionnaire-based surveys, so we do not have figures. Except that in the case where we did, that's our colleague Patricia Paramita, it's 100%, but she did the case of a village who was fully resettled. Then a word on the question Ben, you raised about the possible land grabbing back to the community. Not sure if it's going to happen, of course. But what is interesting is also the land that has not been effectively grabbed, right? When we talk about land deal, land concession, land grabbing, it's an agreement. We hardly find the document. There's a lot of corruption and illegal in it. But it's just a paper. It's just saying, I give you or offer you this. But it doesn't tell how, on the ground, she would or not, and when, and how many, plant the rubber trees. So we found from the field research that land deals were made, but for a number of years, people could continue. So it's not, but it's a space for resistance, the political open one, also economic one, people planting trees to avoid as an attempt to fix their right, not property, but possession. So, yeah, grabbing back. What does Hun Sen, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, put a ban or a stop on further economic land concession, but we don't know yet what's going to happen, if it's going to open a room for maneuver back to small landholders.
Thank you. Also some reflection on what has been said. On the role of the state, you said it's not always consistent or coherent. We talked in the last years of the schizophrenic states. I mean, lots of states have different ministries fighting for different things, and it's of course the same at the local and national level. So one example is that when we discussed the Cambodia and with our partner Seng, working in Ratanakiri, and when we discussed the fact that we will present policy briefs in Rome, that was something we did in 2013, he was saying, well, we also have to produce policy briefs for the local authorities in Ratanakiri, so that they can use it to fight against the national authorities. Okay, so that in the fight against many of human rights violations, I mean, that can be a tool that they could use at the local level, local authorities. So that's just one example. Then on the role of the states in economic land concessions, a concession is always between the state and the company. So there is a very strong role in all this process for the state. One thing, again, we discussed a lot in the UN in the last few years. Each time we do say land grabbing, we have the ambassador of Ethiopia coming and say, you cannot talk about land grabbing because it cannot be grabbed, because the state, for example, in Ethiopia, it's the state who owns the land, so it cannot be grabbed. It's the property of the state, so nobody can grab the land. So we say, okay, but for the local population, for the communities that do not get any information, are not consulted, and the day after tomorrow they are sent, they are forcibly evicted from the land. For them, it's a land grabbing. So there is different ways of analyzing the phenomenon. Anyway, but the role of the state is absolutely clear in all this phenomenon. On livelihood and human rights. So the different forms of dispossessions can be reframed in different human rights violations, and we have discussed. So those who partially lose their land, they can still work a bit on their land, and then maybe you have to complement with work, other work-related activities. But those who completely lose the land, forcibly evicted or maybe displaced, that's another. They also lose access to health, as I said, education, and many other human rights violations. So that's one thing on which we try to work. Another thing is the short-term and long-term impact. Because, of course, human rights violation, you have many at the short term. It's quite clear to say that they are not consulted. That, again, there is no compensation, etc. But then in the long term, it's very difficult to do a human rights, for example, right to food analysis, or livelihood analysis, and in this case it was rubber, it takes, I think, 7 years. So you don't know what will be the long-term impact on these communities. So that's more difficult. What we could see is that if the idea is that lots of people will have access to through salary, and then access to food through salary, and it will depend on their access to work, you can identify people who will not have access to work. Okay, and that can be indigenous peoples, that can be women. People will not enter in these new forms of work that is increasing because of the large-scale land acquisitions. So that's something that we could try to identify, but the short-term, long-term impact is difficult to assess. Then on the usefulness of human rights, we discussed a bit that. So Sofia, again, Monsalve Suarez did an article on that, trying to identify the knowledge of rights or your rights under the law and link to law professionals or NGOs that can help. There was also a report on the former special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, Magdalena Sepulveda, who did a report on access to justice, trying to identify the obstacles in rural areas in having access to justice. I mean, all these obstacles like exist in Laos, for example. So it's extremely difficult to use human rights if you think that human rights means you should have access to justice. So, but there are lots of other advocacy strategies that would be used. Just one figure, something we have found on the basis of our survey. Those in Cambodia, in the communities where we did some research, those who knew their rights under the land law, they had 30% chances of having compensation. And those who didn't know about their rights under the land law, they had 0 chances to have a compensation. 0 people who didn't know about their rights under the land law, they had compensation. So we thought there was a link maybe to the fact of knowing your rights under the law, for example, the fact you could have collective rights to land, and the fact of receiving compensation.
Thank you very much. It's already about 2 p.m., which is time to close. So before closing, I want to turn back to Shaila and Bern as discussant and ask you whether you would have a short additional remark or point that you'd like to make before I close the session. So Bern or Shaila, who would like to go first?
I don't have anything to say, except I hope very much that the Institute will keep its interest in these issues and continue to promote more excellent research.
I'll just echo that and also say that, I guess in response to Peter's point about the challenges of interdisciplinary work, not only within academic disciplines, but between academics and policy worlds, I think, though challenging, I think these discussions are important and worthwhile. So keep at it.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to just say that, remind us that when we opened our authors workshop where we discussed the draft papers, we first had Marcel Mazoyer and Madame Houdard presenting their papers, and they, you know, in a few minutes they took us all the way from ancient Greece to collectivization during the Soviet Union, and this was breathtaking somewhat, and then they said, well, but this is what we can say, and now we don't understand anything about what's going on now, so please tell us. And all the other authors were a bit frightened to continue, but I think you did a great job as guest editors with all the authors to try to make sense, or some sense, of this very complex phenomenon from a multidisciplinary perspective, and with a clear focus which is multi-level, from really infra-national level to the global level. And I hope that what we have done now is a teaser which will give the audience and others really much appetite to open the volume and read in depth the different contributions. Maybe the other thing I'd like to do is to go back to what Bernhard Furher mentioned and to say, well, for us, SNIS, it's one product out of many different activities and products. And actually, for us, it's a major product for the journal, but it's also accompanied by a conference we had here by Marcel Mazoyer during as we were working on that, and a policy debate which is ongoing on the question of forced eviction, which you can find on our website. And we often try to bring the kind of exchange that we have here in Geneva to where it matters most also, which is to the region. And I turn to the guest editors and say that we should certainly reflect between ourselves about a launch event, but also engaging with Southern Research Partner Institution to further this debate in Southeast Asia proper, although I'm sure that you have already a number of such activities and events planned, but let's talk about it. So finally, I want to thank you all for participating in this session, and I take this opportunity just to thank again very much the outgoing editorial manager of International Development Policy, Marie Tordal, who is here and who was absolutely instrumental in first coming up with the idea of this special issue in terms of themes and teams, and who has been accompanying the whole process very professionally. So thanks a lot, Marie, and best wishes for your future adventures. And let me also welcome Frances Rice, who is the new incoming editorial manager, and warm welcome to you, taking the journal forward from where it stands. So I wish you all a very good afternoon, and thank you to the discussants and to the guest editors.